Earthbound, or Mother 2 in Japan, is a game that, on the surface, is a pretty simple tale. A young boy named Ness joins up with a group of friends to stop the evil alien Gygus from turning the world into chaos. But for those of us who grew up with Earthbound, we recognize that it's so much more than that. It's a game about love, friendship, not understanding the world, and seeing things from an entirely different perspective. When we're young, we're often more brave, more willing to take risks. Yet as we grow older, we realize our mortality, slow things down a bit, take things in stride. At least that's the case for me. Earthbound was not successful in terms of sales upon release, yet today it is revered as one of the greatest games ever created. It's near and dear to my heart and has influenced many incredible indie releases throughout the years. Without Earthbound, there's no Undertale, there's no Lisa, no Eastward. It's not that Earthbound was doing anything radically different in terms of gameplay, it was more to do with how it presented itself. Many indie developers have been chasing that magic ever since. Some creators have been successful in capturing the essence of Earthbound's charms, such as the games I previously mentioned. Other games have struggled to differentiate themselves. This brings us to Atlas Wept, an offbeat retro RPG that comes to us from developer Kaboji Soft and publisher Wings. Did Atlas Wept leave me crying tears of joy, or tears of agony? Let's find out in our full review. But hey, don't make me cry. Head on over to patreon.com/idreamofindiegames and you'll gain Discord access, early ad-free shows, an exclusive weekly podcast, shoutouts at the end of every video we produce, and even free games depending on your tier. Your new indie gaming community is waiting for you. After opening up on a basic tutorial, Atlas Wept puts you in control of a mysterious robed character. You don't know who you are, where you are, or just what exactly you're supposed to be doing. But you are level 50 for what it's worth, so clearly this character has been doing some grinding while you were away. Suddenly, you're thrust into the game's battle system, which is triggered by colliding with on-screen enemies that track your every move. You'll quickly come to learn that battles are mostly unavoidable throughout the majority of Atlas Wept. Spoiler alert, they're also the best part of the entire experience. The wavy, psychedelic backdrops, party members with their backs towards the player, and bizarre, often twisted musical compositions are really enough to get any Earthbound fan excited. Even the quirky enemy designs feel uncanny, with twisted, alien-like abominations presented in lovely pixel art. I love turn-based combat, I'll admit, so a fair warning, if you aren't a fan of that particular blend of combat, you'll find almost nothing for you in Atlas Wept, and I mean that quite literally. It is a game that made me feel nothing outside of battle. That's a shame because for a game that is so clearly inspired by another release that was all about feelings, Atlas Wept is almost completely dead inside. Perhaps it's the story. I'm using parentheses for those of you watching the video. There's really no nice way to say this, but Atlas Wept feels as though it was written by a rambling 6th grader. It's so disjointed, convoluted, and impossible to interpret that David Lynch's Mulholland Drive feels digestible in comparison. Atlas Wept feels more like Inland Empire fucked Donnie Darko and we're left to make sense of it all. Games like this are why it's crucial for indie developers to hire a talented writer when creating an RPG, or at the very least a script editor. But I digress, let's try to make sense of the plot that's presented to us. The world in which Atlas Wept takes place is covered by an energy field which is protecting the planet from outside attackers. Two humans come across a robot named G after entering a cave via a hole that is randomly opened up in the earth. G explains that he has lost most of his memories while traveling and will need time to reboot in order to restore the database to its entirety. What he does remember is that he's looking for someone. So the two children, who are named Lucy and Hal, join up with G, or as they call him, Gigi, to help regain his lost memories. Throughout Atlas Wept, you'll suddenly shift to an entirely different party of characters. This secondary cast is led by a young girl named Desi from the town of Boggleville. After running various errands for her parents, Desi meets another character named Charlie and the two venture off on their own adventure. There's a tower in the sky, random monsters, and some truly ridiculous reveals involving certain characters. I assume these moments were supposed to be shocking, but are delivered with no conviction and had me rolling my eyes on more than one occasion. Many of the core issues behind Atlas Wept come back to the writing. Every character feels written with the exact same mannerisms, making it really hard to differentiate their personalities. It feels as if no care was put into creating unique dialogue that could potentially show off the quirks and habits of the cast. This begs the question, if the writers don't care, why should I? The answer is that you shouldn't. Atlas Wept doesn't need to be a literary masterpiece, but that said, my eyes shouldn't be closing while my head nods down and the controller falls from my hands either. A good RPG, like the one that so clearly inspired this game, should have fun character moments and events to keep things engaging, keep the player invested. There's no Ness here who questions why the world is the way it is, no Paula to fall in love with, and no Porky to dread each encounter from. I'm not suggesting Atlas Wept should be a direct copy of Earthbound, but it ultimately feels like they took the look and vibe of that game and sucked out all of the soul. One might say, well, writing isn't everything if a game's still fun, and to that person I say, it isn't everything, but it is a crucial component of the role-playing game genre. Without a compelling reason to care about the overlying conflict, and with a lack of characters that you can get behind and feel emotions for, Atlas Wept ends up an empty shell of a game only held together by a creative and oftentimes enjoyable combat system. Fundamentally, Atlas Wept is designed much like any other 8 to 16-bit retro RPG. The game takes place from a traditional top-down perspective, with players exploring villages and dungeons. You'll have the ability to run, though doing so is mostly useless, as bumping into objects disrupts the animation, and ultimately running feels slower than walking because of this. Movement feels sluggish in general, as this game doesn't scroll along all that smoothly to start with. The general flow of gameplay involves being presented with a task to complete, usually a fetch quest, and inevitably coming across a story beat that leads to a voidless hollow dungeon. The dungeon design is flat, boring, and completely uninspired, with the game's idea of a puzzle usually involving flipping switches back and forth. While there are a few different paths to take depending on the dungeon, most of these areas feel like someone's weekend hobby as opposed to fully fleshed out creations. Even if there were compelling reasons to explore these labyrinths, it would be pretty frustrating to do so. In an attempt to cover up the poorly designed areas, they're filled with a slew of enemies that will track you down faster than the FBI. Even stranger, many of the attribute upgrades in Atlas Wept that you can obtain are randomly out in the open, not hidden or difficult to find at all. Because of this, becoming more powerful just feels unsatisfying, as if your newfound strengths were only earned by suffering through the gameplay loop. These attribute points are presented as stamps that can be attached to a character of your choosing. The system itself isn't awful. In fact, I rather enjoyed figuring out how to place each stamp without overlapping a previously placed stamp. I just wish that collecting stamps had involved effort, not just randomly walking by them on a relatively linear path. But let's talk about the turn-based combat, which, as I alluded to earlier, is the strongest aspect of Atlas Wept. You'll take turns bashing foes with an assortment of regular attacks and magical spells. Sounds traditional enough, right? It is, except for the fact that the game takes a few pages out of the Undertale book. Basic attacks offer up a rhythm minigame of sorts, where 4 cursors come together. Timing your button press just as the cursors intersect will result in dealing additional damage. You can almost think of it like Squall's Gunblade back in the day, where you're rewarded for your timing. It's honestly a pretty fun way to attack, though casting magic is even more enjoyable. Each spell that you cast offers up a unique WarioWare-like minigame for you to participate in. Most of the offensive attacks are again rhythm-based, however, when enemies attack you, things get a little bit more interesting. Enemy attacks may involve you hopping about on a grid, avoiding unique patterns in order to not take damage. While the core concept remains the same throughout, each enemy's attack does feel unique, and that helps to keep the combat feeling fresh, at least for a bit. Unfortunately, battles just go on for far too long, as enemies have what often feels like an endless supply of health. This quickly leads to battle fatigue. Atlas Wept isn't all that challenging on the default intended settings, though you can boost that if you wish, so for as fun as each battle initially presents itself, it soon becomes a snorefest. I spent upwards to 10 minutes real time in battles depending on how many enemies swarmed me at once, which left me completely burned out. Visually, Atlas Wept isn't all that much to look at. In the spirit of Earthbound, the game goes for a mix of 8 and 16-bit pixel art, and while it serves the purpose, many of the environments also feel quite bland. The dungeons in particular just have no personality, and even the few villages that you come across aren't that lively or fun to explore. While the game also bites off of the classic Earthbound font in its menus, the dialogue boxes are bland and boring. As I alluded to earlier, there's just no character portrait art at all, so all told, the game really doesn't do much in the visual department to help it stand out from the other great indie RPGs in this space. But on the flip side, I actually quite liked the soundtrack featured in Atlas Wept, which is clearly inspired by the zany and trippy noises of the Mother series as well. Many of the compositions loop around far too soon, but most of them are pretty well done. You'll hear plenty of haunting synths and unusual noises. The sound effects feature a nice retro tone that wouldn't have felt all that out of place in the late 80s, early 90s. All told, it isn't revolutionary or new, but the sound work is handled well by someone who clearly listened to a great deal of Earthbound's OST. Atlas Wept is a game that ultimately feels undercooked. The lack of any sort of compelling narrative hurts the overall experience deeply. The turn-based combat has some pretty good ideas and is fun in short bursts, but is far too frequent with battles that last what feels like an eternity. And while the visuals are enough to get by and the sound is quite lovely, it just isn't enough to save it. While not a complete indie Krampus, Atlas is certainly shrugging at this one.
Oh no!